So does it mean, are you implying that country will not be possible to use Kyoto mechanism, or are you implying that things?
Say again, am I implying?
If the country...
What am I implying?
Yeah, implying many things maybe. Okay, then my question is, if countries do not support KP2, do you think that country will not be able to use Kyoto mechanism credit?
No, well, that's very clear. I mean, obviously, only Kyoto countries can use Kyoto mechanisms. That's why the United States can't use the Kyoto mechanism, because they're not a Kyoto country. So, I mean, that's just, you know, very clear. Those countries that are in Kyoto can use the Kyoto mechanisms. Those that are not, cannot. That is a relatively simple fact. There are many things that are not simple in climate, but that one is a relatively simple one.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. With regard to the use of flexible mechanisms or market mechanisms, I think that if the Kyoto Protocol second commitment period would be created or continued, and but at the same time, based on Cancun agreements, for example, the scheme for RED Plus will be operationalized, and new mechanisms, depending on the results of the new mechanism, discussion on new mechanisms, some new market mechanism, in addition to, for example, existing international emission trading or green development mechanism, would be introduced. Then the question arises that whether these two agreements, the KP2 and new agreements to be reached in future, hopefully in Durban, how the linkage would be operationalized. In other words, there are some concerns within Japan that if Japan would need to subscribe in the KP2 Annex B, the new target for 2020, and how these targets can be achieved. Particularly, how would Japan would be able to use the flexibility mechanisms. The currently available mechanism is emissions trading, JI, and the clean development mechanism. Of course, I understand that there are a number of efforts going on to improve or streamline the CDM, but still there are big limitations. So the question may arise that the KP2 can provide a new linkage between the existing Kyoto mechanisms and the new market mechanism, including RED Plus, or of course, I understand there are still discussions that whether there should be a market mechanisms allowed with regard to RED Plus, but still there may be a possibility. So whether these the existing Kyoto mechanisms and RED Plus and other new mechanisms could be linked. So I wish to know your views, even both of you.
Absolutely. The fact is that the rules for the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol have not been written. And those rules will be written by governments once they agree to continue with the Kyoto Protocol. And it would, I think, be in the interest of all countries for the rules of a possible second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol to include not just the existing flexibility mechanisms, but, as you say, for example, RED Plus, which is a very new sector. Some of you may remember that there was a group of countries that were trying to get that sector into the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And in fact, it was Brazil at that time that actually was able to bring together a group of countries that then finally stopped the inclusion of that sector into the Kyoto Protocol. Brazil has changed its position on this and is in fact one of the enthusiastic supporters of RED Plus nowadays. And hence, we now have agreement under the Cancun agreements for a RED Plus mechanism. As you say, there is no agreement yet as to whether that's going to be an offset-based mechanism or not, but there are many countries interested in that, and so it is not beyond the stretch of an imagination that countries may choose to include that as part of flexibility mechanisms in a second commitment period.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, I think, as Christiana said, the principles of Kyoto are things that we don't want to lose, and the fact that the idea that you have a group of countries who want to reduce emissions and have found ways of doing that and of helping themselves and of involving other countries in doing that. I think, we want to all countries to join the sort of Kyoto boat, if you like. So by stepping out of the boat, we're not going to encourage other countries to join. And as Christiana said, that the rules of a second commitment haven't been written yet. And that's up to those involved, so it's an opportunity for those involved to write them. And that as long as we're making sure that the emissions cuts are really happening, and we're giving credit equally for them happening in the right way, according to the principles that have been agreed so far, I think we should be thinking flexibly about how we go about the challenge of reducing the overall emissions in the world, and that's what Kyoto is all about, and I think that's what Cancun should be about as well.
Last question: flexible mechanism. Again, it has something to do with fragmentation of the total regime. Some people say UNFCCC is not dead, but it's not working very well because it's to decide things take long negotiation and time consuming. It's not so flexible at all. So some people argue that there should be some, in addition to UNFCCC scheme or framework, we have to have more flexible framework which can incorporate more flexible mechanism. And so what do you think those kind of fragmentation of the regime or market which is actually happening these days?
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I would say, what ingredients are you putting into that new framework that aren't in the UNFCCC that are going to make it be any different? In the end, it's about political will of countries to change their policies and move to a low-carbon society. And the UNFCCC is the best process and the process that we have for doing that. I don't understand how a new process would, or a separate process would help that, because you'd still have the same countries with the same attitudes, just in under a different framework. I mean, I think we can be flexible within the UNFCCC as well. There's no set way that we have to go, and it's up to member countries, as I'm sure Christiana would say, to make the decisions about the direction of the UNFCCC process and what it decides. So I would want to know what new magic ingredient a separate framework had that was going to change the paradigm of the debate. Thanks.
Yeah, good point. Very good point, Richard. And I would add to that the following thoughts. We, of course, are very aware of the fact that not only Japan, but also the United States and a couple of other countries are thinking about their own bilateral market mechanisms. And if these move forward, it would constitute a certain fragmentation of the market. Now, I have a couple of questions to that scenario. The first is, what methodologies would be used to establish that a ton is a ton? How would you go forward and be able to establish in each of the project sectors or the policy sectors the emission reductions? My suspicion is that even in a scenario of fragmentation of the market, that the methodologies that would be used would be heavily influenced by the more than 100 methodologies that have been developed under the CDM. So, as Richard said, what else would be new if we're now using the methodologies of the CDM? Second thought is, an offset has value if it is convertible. If the offset can only be used in a restricted universe, in a restricted bilateral universe, even worse, between two countries, then the offset very quickly loses value. The value of an offset as a currency is commensurate with the convertibility of that offset and the size of the universe in which that offset can be used. So I would question whether offsets that only have a value between two countries are really, from an economic point of view, a wise way to go in the long run. Maybe you want in the short run to begin to exercise that, but in the long run, is that really in the interest of those two countries because you severely restrict the value of that offset? And finally, my third question to the scenario is, how would you ensure the avoidance of double counting? Because from an environmental perspective, from the atmosphere's perspective, which is the responsibility of the Secretariat, we have to ensure that there's no double counting. And in a fragmented market, it would be very difficult to do the accounting, to track accounting, when there's no universal accounting that ensures that a ton is either here or there, but not in two places at the same time. So those are a couple of the questions. Now, that doesn't mean that that we in the Secretariat would be completely opposed to a fragmentation of the market. We realize that this is certainly within the prerogative of countries to choose which way to go. My concern would be if it is used as almost, let's say, a learning ground to see where the market can be improved from where we are. We would certainly welcome all efforts to improve the market, but I doubt whether it can be seen as the end step. It could be seen as a transitory step, but I would certainly question then where we would get the universality of both methodologies to know that a ton in this bilateral market is the equivalent of a ton in this bilateral market and equivalent in this market. And so you have to have certain harmonizing principles and methodologies and accounting systems in order for it to work for the countries involved and certainly for the planet.